Рождеством Христовым. Я буду говорить на английском языке. Место, которое я буду читать, это будет, основное место будет Галатам, 4 глава, 1 стих до 6 стиха. И мы в конце будем читать Римлянам, 8 глава, 19 стих. The reason why I chose the passage that I chose, the reason why it's in the epistles rather than in the decree or basically the Gospels where they explain how Christ was born is because the epistles are an explanation of the Gospels. So for me, it was easier to get the explanation rather than the actual. So I would want to turn to Galatians chapter 4, verse 1, and we'll read till verse 6. Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, does not differ at all from a slave, though he is a master of all, but is under guardians and stewards until the time appointed by the Father. Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, crying out, Abba, Father. Here, Paul is explaining, he's basically making a comparison right before. And he's explaining to the people why they don't need to be in the law, or why they're not under the law now, but under Christ. And so he tells them a really good comparison. He compares basically how a child, when he is of young age, he does not know that he has basically the inheritance. He does not have authority. He's treated basically the same way as a slave. And so Paul makes that comparison to the Galatians in the present time. And he says, even so we, when we were children, were in the bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoptions as sons. My theme is Christ's birth has made us sons of God. And the two verses that I'll be looking into are basically 4 and 5. The fullness of time. Prior to Christ's coming, it is estimated that over 360 prophecies were fulfilled. Or at the time of Christ's coming. 360 prophecies. God prepared His way. God prepared a plan for all of us, or for Israel, for Christ to come. He prepared John the Baptist. He prepared many prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, who talked about Christ's coming. And finally, when this moment had come, it happened and Christ came. Prior to Christ's coming, according to this passage, people were never called sons of God. Why? Because it says here, before the fulfillment of the time, he compares it and says, just as a little child who is in a house, he doesn't differ from a slave. And he says basically that we were slaves of the law. That's why when Christ came, He released us from that bondage. We were slaves of the law, and we were slaves of the elements of this world. Basically, we were slaves of this world prior to Christ's coming. Now, after Christ came, we were released from that bondage, from that slavery, and we were made sons of God. 1 John chapter 3, verse 1, he says, we can actually read it, that way it's more accurate. 1 John chapter 3, verse 1, he says, Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed on us, that we should be called children of God. He exclaims that and says, what manner of love do we have that we should be called children of God? Prior to that, nobody in history were ever called children of God. Of course, there are passages that say the sons of God, but nowhere in history were we called dear to God, were or even Israel, they were called slaves of God. The second thing I want to pay attention to is God sent forth His Son. God declared that Christ is going to come, and then even at the coming of Christ, He told the shepherds as well as to other people that He came. Meaning Christ wasn't born and then in 20, 30 years He came out and said, hey, I'm the Son of God. It didn't happen that way. Or else that way wouldn't be as accurate. Christ showed us a very accurately way. Before Christ was ever to speak, before He was able to speak as a human, God said, this is my Son. So that in itself gives us the accuracy and gives us the confidence that Christ is in reality the Son of God. In the King James Bible, I have the New King James Bible. In the King James Bible it says, made of a woman and made under the law. In my Bible it says, born of a woman and born under the law. In order that Christ would save us, or in order that we would be able to become sons of God, Christ had to become a man. Christ's becoming of a man was not the beginning of Christ. Christ had a beginning way prior to that. And He not only does He have a beginning prior to that, He never had a beginning. He was before the beginning. And then Christ's birth is the beginning of His flesh, the beginning of His body. And that is eternal. When we see Christ in heaven, we will see Him as what? Revelation declares to us. What will we see Him as? Я по-русски скажу. Когда мы увидим Христа в небе, какой образ мы увидим? Один из образов. Сына человеческого. И еще там написано, что it says that we will see His hands pierced. We will see His piercings. That means that He will be in the form of a body of a man. Therefore, Christ, once He became a man, He's always a man. He will never return to the form prior what He had before He became a man. That is a great sacrifice that Christ has made in order for us to be called the sons of God. And that is why John declares with excitement and says, what manner of love was bestowed on us that we shall be called the sons of God. Now, as Paul says here, when the child is still young, he doesn't differentiate between a slave. We are called the sons of God through faith, but it has not come to pass yet that we have obtained the inheritance completely. But it will come to pass one day when we will inherit the full inheritance and we will be in the glory of God as fully sons of God. And that is written in Romans chapter 8. If we turn to it, Romans chapter 8, verse 19. It says this. For the earnest expectation of creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. The creation itself, when Christ was born, the creation waited for it. And when Christ was born, the stars, the sheep, there were sheep, and all the creation saw that Christ was born. Now the creation groans and waits for the revealing of the sons of God, which is us. And we will be revealed. When will we be revealed? We will be revealed in the fullness of time, as my first point was. And that time, my second point, God will declare it. No one is going to declare the time but God alone. And God will declare that time when we will be revealed as sons of God. And because Christ was made a man and born of a woman and became subject to the law, then one day we will have full access to the inheritance of being sons of God. Amen.
Amen.